So I want to talk about a video recently posted on Capturing Christianity featuring two Christian theologians, Stephen Nemes and Ryan Mullins, titled, Is God Personal Like Us? It's an interesting discussion between two very intelligent guys, and I recommend you watch the full video. As an outsider, that is, a non-believer who hasn't read much pure theology, I found a lot here to excite me to cogitation. And I wanted to sort of provide my own perspective on this discussion. The discussion is contrasting classical theism, represented by Nemes, and what Mullins calls modified classical theism. Classical theism, as the name implies, is sort of the traditional view among many, if not most, Christian denominations today.
I think that classical theism is more or less the view of God that is suggested and required by Roman Catholicism. Edward Fazer makes this point. He says that the doctrine of divine simplicity is de fide. It was defined as an essential part of the faith. I forget it, which, councils. I would also make the point that, classical Reformed theology is also classically theistic in a lot of ways, right? The Westminster Confession affirms the simplicity of God, and various other theologians in the Reformed tradition on the continent and elsewhere affirm the doctrine of divine simplicity in the classical theistic position more generally. And this is, again, because they're inheritors of Thomas Aquinas. So I think that it's not just Catholicism, not just Protestantism. Even in Eastern Orthodoxy, if you read John of Damascus, Eastern Orthodoxy develops a little bit perhaps with Gregory Palamas and others later on, but if you read John of Damascus, he is very much a hardcore classical theist, as committed and as hardcore as the rest of them.
What makes this interesting is that the classical theistic God is really, really weird. Now, watching this video isn't the first time I've become aware of this fact, but Nemes's bold and unflinching defense of the classical position really helps solidify my thoughts on the nature of this weirdness. Here are some highlights of Nemes and Mullins discussing what exactly this version of God is like.
Classical theism is a certain understanding of God and of his relationship to the world, which has its roots, at least in the Western world, in ancient Greek philosophy, especially in the philosophical understanding of Plato and Aristotle, and later inheritors of that tradition, such as Plotinus, and then the Christian appropriators of that philosophical school. There are corollaries to classical theism in other religions as well, like in Hinduism. There are certain forms of Hinduism that resemble Christian classical theism in certain respects. But basically, classical theism is an idea about God that understands the nature of God through the relation that obtains between him and the order of finite beings. Basically, what classical theism says is that God is that in virtue of which finite being exists, or finite beings, have being. And the classical theistic position basically understands finite beings such as you and me, horses, cats, Pat Metheny, whatever, as being in a certain way. There are certain conditions, ontological conditions, which apply to all finite beings whatsoever. And God is understood as not being anything like that. Precisely because the conditions of finite being are limiting and they necessitate an explanation. Precisely because finite being is a certain way, there's need of something that is not finite, that is not that does not exist in the same way in order to cause the finite being to exist and to give it existence in every moment. And God, therefore, is understood by way of contrast with finite beings. With respect to the question of whether or not God is a person, I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail later, but the short answer is that classical theism does not conceive of God as a person in the way that we, as finite beings, are personal. If God can be described as a person, it would have to be in a way that is radically different from us, because again, our personality is an aspect of our finitude. It's an aspect of the fact that we're finite and limited in various ways.
So the claim is that God is perfectly happy, and that happiness is grounded entirely in himself. So anything that you do, that can influence his happiness. Anything that you are cannot make him angry or make him do anything. He can't react, because that would be to influence God, something external influencing God. So God cannot react.
Obviously, I don't think that God is nothing,
Yeah.
but I would say that God is no thing. He's not a thing. He's not like he's not subject to the conditions of thingness, but he's not nothing either. He's something that is beyond thingness.
All right, well, let's switch
I mean,
and talk
I
to,
don't know what that means, but yeah, that's fine.
Now, the question is, why worship him? This is a really fascinating question, and this is something that I've been speculating on lately. I'm thinking about the question of worship of God in light of the fact that God, according to classical theism, does not enter into any real relations with his creatures. So God, for example, is not affected. He does not hear. He is not like listening to my song of worship. When I sing before the throne of God above, for example, it's not like God is like moved and receives that worship in some way. So then the question is, okay, what does it mean to actually worship God? Here I would like to propose a speculative interpretation of Irenaeus's line that the glory of God is the human being fully alive. I think that, what it is to worship God, or this is the idea that I'm entertaining. I'm speculating here. I'm not committed to this. What does it mean to worship God? It means to be a human being. Right, to live your life and to be a human being as created by God, and to actualize your potentiality, and to hold on to life and to love it. So to be thankful to God for the things that he gives you is just to be thankful for them. And to love God is just to love your being and to love the fact of being and to accept it and to live in the world in a kind of a gratitude for being. These are speculative proposals, and I can't enter into a lot of detail here. I don't know that I could develop it that very much, but this is a way that I'm thinking of the nature of worship given classical theism. What we can say is that God hears our songs and accepts them somehow, right? Because he's impassible, he's immutable. That is thrown out the window.
I encourage you again to watch the full video for more context on these statements. Now, this stands, I think, in stark contrast with what most Christians actually think of when they think of God. I know most people don't literally conceptualize God as an old man who lives in the clouds, but my understanding is they tend to think of God as a loving father figure who watches over them, shares their struggles, suffers when they suffer, is angry or disappointed when they do bad things, but is pleased when they do good things or seek his forgiveness. The God of classical theism is nothing like that. He's pure, undifferentiated reality, which for some reason we use a male pronoun for. He's beyond our comprehension. As an aside, when this view is combined with some of the actions that are often attributed to the Christian God, like commanding genocide or sending people to eternal torment, it can turn him into a sort of Lovecraftian horror, an unfeeling, incomprehensible malevolence underlying the universe itself that can't be meaningfully challenged practically or even morally. But they don't get into that in this video. And yet, as I understand it, this is historically and today the dominant view of God among Christian theologians. What I'm interested in this video is the reason for this disconnect. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably raised an eyebrow hearing that the God of classical theism doesn't get angry or any other emotion than undisturbed happiness. Like, these guys are both Christian, though. Have you heard of this thing called the Bible? This God's never happy. He's always angry. That's his secret. Well, Nemes admits that the Bible doesn't provide a metaphysically adequate description of God, and he argues the stories are meant more to motivate certain actions than to reveal God's true nature. To which Mullins replies, "Isn't that pretty much lying, though?"
I might think I've been duped, right? I might think, hang on, like I thought God was like this, and it turns out God's completely different. He's the exact opposite. He's nothing remotely like what the Bible described. It seems like something really deceitful has happened here.
You see, Mullins defends a version of God that somewhat resembles the classical God, but is much more personal and emotional, and therefore easier to reconcile with the biblical text. This doesn't satisfy Nemes, though, because he knows that the classical God exists based on independent philosophical arguments. He's willing to reinterpret the Bible to fit that conception, not the other way around. For Nemes, Mullins' God is just not unique enough, not ultimate enough. I actually think it's telling that both of these guys at some point sort of suggest that the other's position is tantamount to atheism, or making God into a non-God.
Because that would be to say God's like a particular being. I have to say God's beyond existence. So, but again, if I say God's beyond existence, well, A, I don't really know what that means. Because I feel like my atheist friends are going to be like, yeah, that's right. God's beyond existence.
Given the way that Ryan has defined God, really those four attributes that he talks about, those apply to any finite being at all. So I think that what Ryan's model does is effectively to make God a being like the rest of us. And the difficulty arises in the fact that, because he's a being, well, for any kind of being, there could be two of them. So in principle, there could be two of these kinds of beings, just like there can be two human beings or two cats or two dogs. Whereas on the other hand, given the definition that divine simplicity supplies of God, there cannot possibly be two absolutely simple, undifferentiated, pure realities, right? There's no room for multiplicity given that definition.
What really set my thinker a-thonking was this statement.
I'll give one other definition that I think all these models of God can agree on, that there's a sense in which you want to say, whatever God is, he is the single or sole ultimate ground of all of reality. So if you want to say like there's a bunch of contingent stuff, then God's got to be the explanation for all of that. If a bunch of stuff is necessarily exists, then you want to say, well, God still has to be the explanation for all of that. So whatever that rock bottom thing in reality is. And I think these, again, I want to say all the models of God we discussed today, they all want to affirm this.
I think the key phrase there is every model discussed today. But let's remind ourselves that people have been worshiping gods before they had any idea about the rock bottom of reality. They believed in gods that were active persons in the world, who lived, loved, fought, and perhaps most importantly, were responsive to prayer and worship. They weren't human, but were basically like humans even more than Mullins' model would allow. And this goes for the earliest worshippers of Yahweh, too. Like they said, this classical theism stuff didn't start with the Jews, it started with the Greeks. That's why the Bible is the way it is. Of course, when these guys think of God, they're both thinking of this theology stuff. But I, possibly because I'm just more interested in the mythological side of things, tend to think of God as first and foremost a mythical or legendary idea like angels, unicorns, and elves, rather than a metaphysical or philosophical one. Now, I've studied Greek philosophy a bit, and it seems like what happened is this. When people got to really thinking about stuff, they realized that these mythological gods like you find in Homer just didn't make that much sense. Like, who can really believe that there's a guy up there in the sky throwing lightning bolts at people and randomly raping women? It's primitive superstition. It's ridiculous. And besides, to be worthy of worship, shouldn't the gods be perfectly good? And shouldn't they be perfectly content? And so on? Of course, very few philosophers denied the concept of gods or said to stop worshipping them, for I'm sure many reasons, but perhaps the most obvious being that it was a good way to get banished or executed. So they had to change the way they thought about what God was. An unmoved mover. Now that sounds plausible, sure. That's something a reasonable person can believe in, so that's what God is. But that's not what God had been before, and not what it was for most lay people. These concepts were, and still are, pretty much only relevant to the highly educated or the philosophically adventurous. Philosophers took this widespread concept of a mythical being or beings and came up with a much more exalted conception of it, such as classical theism. I don't think any part of what I've just said is really that controversial, historically speaking. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that inherently. Educated people making sense of an ordinary concept in ways that defy the common understanding of it is just what educated people do, all the time. It's what Einstein did for time and space. But where I think it becomes pathological in the case of theism is when it remains rooted in mythology. A lot of Christian theologians are stuck insisting that the undifferentiated reality in virtue of which finite beings exist also has an only son named Jesus of Nazareth, that he made a covenant with the nation of Israel and told them to sacrifice animals to him, and so on. And this is like if Platonists were to say that the form of the good is God, but also throws thunderbolts at people. It's actually more absurd than just a guy who throws thunderbolts. I see modified classical theism trying to ease this tension by making God more human-like, but in doing so it takes on some of the problems associated with that more human-like concept, which classical theism was supposed to do away with. This God is, at least in Nemes's view, not sufficiently exalted or simple or fundamental to reality, and I don't think you can ever strike balance that will satisfy everyone here, because the problem is this. The human-like aspects that make God less acceptable to people like Nemes are precisely the same qualities that make God appealing to normal believers, both today and throughout all history. People want a God who's relatable, who's like us, but better. I mean, I'm pretty sure my granny would be outraged to hear him say that God doesn't hear us singing Hallelujah, my sweet Lord. On the other hand, you could just go full deist, throw away the mythology, say screw you, granny, but then classical theism just isn't really as relevant. I mean, if I were to become convinced that a classical God existed without buying into any particular religion, I kinda wouldn't care that much. What difference does it make, really, besides being a subject of intellectual curiosity? What Nemes said about worshipping God by being thankful and making good use of the life you've been given, that is a really noble and beautiful idea. But also, I'm already trying to do that. Strange as it might sound, I'm even doing it by making this video. So that's about all I wanted to say. I feel like I've left this video on capturing Christianity, which you should watch, with a clearer view of the conflict that exists between the personal God and the kind of God put forward by people like Thomas Aquinas or whoever. So I want to thank Cameron Bertuzzi and his two guests for exposing me and all of us to the intellectual side of Christianity. Interesting stuff, for sure.